I've been asked to talk to you about ethics, about equity and equality. I thought by way of introduction, I'd talk a little bit about the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome was formed in 1968 and is famous for a book called Limits to Growth, which was published in 1972. This was an analysis of humanity's ecological footprint. It's often been misquoted as being anti-economic growth. In fact, it didn't review economic growth at all. What it looked at was our ecological footprint. It examined what would happen in terms of population, in terms of pollution, in terms of industrial output over a period of 200 years, from 1900 through to 2100. And in 1972, it predicted that if we carried on growing at the current rate, if the population carried on increasing, if we carried on increasing our rate of industrial output and pollution, then we would go into overshoot. We would reach a situation around the middle of the century where we would be creating too much pollution, we would be using up too many of the world's resources, and eventually we would face the prospect of decline. The book originally said that this was easily avoided. All we needed to do was slow the rate of population growth and slow the rate of industrial output a little bit, and we could avoid that overshoot and decline. But of course, because a lot of new economists came along, the Chicago School notably, in the 1970s, and said this is all nonsense, we can grow as much as we like, unconstrained. In fact, of course, we haven't done anything to change that, and the predictions made in 1972 have turned out to be not just slightly right, they've been absolutely correct. If you go back and look at the numbers that were predicted in 1972, they are pretty much exactly what's happened in the last 40 years. So we're now in a situation where we are in overshoot. There are too many people using too many resources on the planet. In fact, we're living at the rate of 1.6 planet Earths right now. And if everybody in the world wants to live at the same standard that you have in Australia, then we need 4 planet Earths. It's simply not possible. And so we have to reduce our ecological footprint per person, and that ideally means reducing the population, but of course that's extremely difficult, but we certainly need to reduce the rate of increase of the population, and we need to reduce our ecological footprint per person until it comes back into balance. That must happen, of course, mostly in the developed world, where most of the problem occurs, so that we can allow the developing world the chance to grow. If we don't do that, then there will come a collapse at some point. And so that's really what the focus of the Club of Rome is about. It's about trying to avoid that collapse by trying to encourage people to reduce their ecological footprint. Let me move on to ethics now. If you hear any strange noises in the background, those, I'm afraid, are the sounds of a lot of builders outside, which is the nature of Hong Kong these days. Certainly, when it comes to ethics, we need to ask ourselves some fundamental questions. A sample of these perhaps might be, do we have a responsibility to future generations? Do we actually have to build our economic systems so that we think about the needs of future generations? That's not a question that we ask very often, and it's not obvious what the answer is. It seems like it's obvious, but it's one that we should be asking and trying to find an answer to. Secondly, should anyone or any country or any business have the right to profit from natural resources? Arguably, the world's natural resources belong to all of us equally. They actually belong to all species. If you think about something like water, then every species of plant, animal requires water. So does anybody have the right to profit from natural resources? And we've kind of assumed that they do, and I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves once more. And thirdly, do we want to have businesses in our economies that offer no social value? I'm thinking about a lot of food businesses or fizzy drinks manufacturers who are producing products which are fundamentally bad for us, which cause us all sorts of medical and obesity problems, and yet nobody does anything to stop these. Should we actually stop businesses that don't offer any social value? Now, there are lots of ethical questions that we could be asking, but to me, a lot of that would simply lead to a lot of environmentalists doing a lot of probably interesting but not very useful navel gazing. the question that I think helps answer that or explain that is to say, well, do we want to have ethical bankers and do we want to have ethical businessmen? And my answer to that question is no. I do not want to set up a business school to train bankers and businessmen to be ethical. I don't want to teach them about ethics at all. Because for every banker who behaves ethically in the developed world, say, there will be another one in the developing world who doesn't have this sort of education, who will be perfectly at liberty to behave unethically, or the other way around, in the developing world being exploited by the developed world. What I do care about is having bankers and businessmen who are obeying the law. It's not a question about ethics. It's not a question about appealing to their greater sense of morality. It's a question of them obeying the law. What we need are tight regulations to make sure that the sort of exploitation of the environment that goes on does not happen, and the sort of financial bubbles that are created do not have to happen. So it's a question of laws, not about ethics. So I think the whole ethical debate is one that we should push aside and focus much more on the regulatory debate. Let me move on now and talk a little bit about equality. There is a perception that economic growth is essential for the creation of jobs, and that the creation of jobs will reduce inequality. That because more people have work, they will be able to earn an income, and therefore the gap between rich and poor will shrink. In the developed world, that belief is fundamentally wrong. We have had, in the last 30 years, the fastest growth, the fastest economic growth in human history. At no point at any time over the last several thousand years has the world economy grown so fast in such a short time. And yet, in the rich world, in the developed world, unemployment has gone up. It's gone up steadily since the late 1970s across the OECD. So economic growth has not created jobs. It certainly hasn't created sufficient jobs. And of course, since the financial crisis in 2007, unemployment has gone up even more. Economic growth does not reduce inequality either, as we know from Thomas Piketty's book recently, but we knew this many years ago as well. Economic growth does not reduce inequality. Built into the system are advantages for those who are rich and powerful, and disadvantages for those who are poor, and so the current economic system actually increases inequality, almost by design. Let me just give you an example of that. In the US, between 1980 and 2010, the economy increased in size by 130%. There was a 50% rise in productivity, and yet during that time, average real wages fell 11%, working hours rose by 9%, and today 1 in 6 American families lives in poverty. And this is supposed to be an economic system that the rest of the world is meant to copy or emulate. It seems to me to be fundamentally flawed. And the same is true in almost every other OECD country. The gap between rich and poor has grown in the last 30 years. There are only a few examples where it has shrunk. The Gini coefficient has actually fallen in France and a few of the Nordic countries, and it hasn't increased very much in places like Japan. But in most of the world, and certainly in Australia and the UK and the US, the gap between rich and poor has widened. It's also widened between the rich world and the poor world, and in the poor world, of course, it's widened too. So the number of people who are living in poverty compared to the number of people living in riches today has widened in the last 30 or 40 years, and despite all this economic growth. So let's banish this idea that economic growth is a solution to inequality and inequity. In fact, our economic system today requires ever-rising production. That is the pillar on which it is based, which requires us to use ever more resources, which generates ever more pollution. And of course, the problem for all of us is how we get off this bandwagon. If we move into a situation where we attempt to reduce the rate of output, to lower resource use, then we end up in a situation with no growth. That leads to lower consumption, which leads to lower output, which leads to lower resource use. We quickly get into a downward spiral if we try and stop the economic juggernaut that we are currently riding. And as soon as that happens, it leads to higher unemployment and yet more inequality. So it appears that we are trapped between two rather difficult worlds. We can either carry on down the current path, carry on focusing on economic growth and increasing the gap between rich and poor and increasing the rate of inequality, or we can try and get off this juggernaut and actually make things even worse. We will increase the rate of unemployment and increase the level of inequality even further. So it seems like we're in a bit of a catch-22. That's not actually the case. There are a lot of attempts, a lot of theories to try and knock us off this treadmill without causing a lot of damage. The circular economy, the performance economy, decoupling, but they don't actually fundamentally get to the root of the problem. They treat some of the symptoms. So I'll talk in a few minutes about some of the ways we can get off this treadmill, although it does take some time. Before then, I just want to touch on one other issue which is very important, because we've seen unemployment rise over the last 30 years. And what we're going to see is the rate of unemployment accelerate dramatically in the next 20 or 30 years. Of course, a lot of you are aware of studies and books like The Second Machine Age, a study at Oxford University last year as well, on the future of employment. And the basic message is that the science fiction that we've been talking about for so many years is about to become fact, and that will make our challenges harder still. Thanks to Moore's law and the doubling of computing capacity or chip capacity every 2 years or so, the amount of processing power that we have has been increasing dramatically. Now, we haven't really seen the effects of that. It's been a kind of a slow creep up until now, but it's about to become very noticeable, so that it will change our lives. Now, that has a huge potential upside, because we can free ourselves up from the drudgery of work to do something much more useful, or if we don't manage this process properly, then we can end up with a massive increase in the rate of unemployment. Just to try and put paint a clearer picture of what this means, it's now possible, for example, for doctors, computerized doctors, to diagnose problems more accurately than real doctors. If you think about it, that's not terribly surprising, because a computer can store all medical history of humanity and all the medical history of an individual. It will know how different drugs interact with each other, and it will know about the latest papers that have been published. So it can search through that database and diagnose a patient's problems more accurately than somebody who's trying to remember what they read last week. But that gives you a hint of what's likely to come. There are now robots that can act as cooks, that can act as waiters and waitresses, and what's clever about these robots is not that they are single function machines, but that they can be programmed to do a variety of different tasks and cook a variety of different meals. I would certainly recommend, when you've got 15 minutes free, to watch a YouTube video called Humans Need Not Apply, which will give you some greater insight into what's happening here. We can have trucks that drive without drivers and cars without drivers, and that's going to be something that, of course, Google has been experimenting with, but which will increasingly affect our lives. It alone would take away 3 million jobs in the US in the next 20 years once we have self-driving vehicles. And of course, robots will have the potential to transform the way we live and help the elderly. A study which was done by Frey and Osborne at Oxford at the end of last year showed that 47% of all jobs are actually at risk from this wave of computerization. These are not jobs like we've seen mechanized in the past. They're not simple low-grade jobs. These are often quite high-level jobs. So that bank analysts or insurance clerks or auditors and accountants, legal assistants, in fact a lot of the people who train to be lawyers start off their careers working, correcting contracts and doing research in legal firms and are very well paid for it. Well, a lot of that can be computerized now, in which case we are taking away a lot of very highly skilled jobs. Waiters and waitresses, couriers and messengers, retail assistants, taxi drivers and carpenters, a lot of those jobs are very vulnerable to being taken away by machines in the next 20 years or so. And what sort of jobs will remain? Well, it's going to be those that involve close contact between human beings, so people that are doing editing perhaps of particular manuscripts, people who do choreography or teach dancing, but very skilled jobs which require human interaction, which are typically not very well paid. So we have a fundamental change taking place in the workplace, and that is adding to the problem of inequality, and therefore requires us to come up with some unconventional solutions if we are to address these problems. To finish then, let me try and talk about some of the potential solutions to these issues, because clearly economic growth is not the answer, because it makes inequality and unemployment worse. What can we do to fix these problems without breaking this treadmill of growth that we have to somehow stay on? What we need are solutions that meet 4 criteria. They must make sure that it does not cost more to act than not to act. So if it costs more to do something, then people tend to be not interested. So we have to do something which actually reduces our costs, and that makes it more attractive to people. Whatever we do must also not lead to higher levels of unemployment and even greater inequality. Thirdly, whatever we do must be welcomed by the democratic majority. And finally, it must offer immediate benefits to most people. We've tried for years, and the Club of Rome has tried for 40 years and failed to get its message across, because people are not interested fundamentally in doing something for the long term. As Groucho Marx so aptly put it, why should I do anything for my grandchildren? What have they ever done for me? So we need to come up with solutions that meet these criteria, and there are some of those solutions available. Let me just give you, I'm working on a book right now that explores a dozen of those, but let me just give you a flavour of them by exploring 3. One thing we can do is we can increase welfare payments. We can increase payments to the unemployed. This immediately boosts consumption because it allows them to spend more because their incomes go up. It actually increases wages in the employed sector as well, because it has to provide people with an incentive not to be unemployed. So it boosts the level of wages, and it provides a better safety net. It shifts the balance slightly from the big corporations who are trying to squeeze down wages to the workers who are trying to improve their standard of living. If we provide everybody with a safety net, and we provide them with the knowledge that they will have an income no matter whether or not they have a job, then we can begin to right the balance. We can begin to reduce the level of inequality, and we can provide more of an incentive for employers not to hire interns but to pay people properly. This needs to be very heavily policed, but higher welfare payments are a way of gradually shifting the balance away from the employer to the employee and increasing average wages. Now, how do we pay for these higher welfare benefits? Well, we can do that by taxing corporations properly and by taxing resources. We need to tax resource use, and taxing employment actually less. So that's one way we can begin to move the entire system in a different direction. Of course, it takes time. These changes are not going to happen overnight. I'm talking about 10 or 20 years. A second thing we can do is shorten the working year. Carlos Slim, the Mexican billionaire, talked recently about reducing the working week to 3 days. There was an advert recently in Vienna suggesting that we should make it law that for any new job, rather than it being offered or advertised as a job for one person, that it should by law be offered for 2 people part-time to try and create more work and spread incomes more evenly. But one other way to do that is to shorten the working year by offering people a greater amount of holiday each year, perhaps 1 or 2 days more each year, and over a period of 10 or 20 years, you increase the amount of holiday dramatically, which requires businesses to hire more people. We can also shorten the working day. So that's another way that we can begin to gradually boost the level of employment without radically changing the system. A further way is something called tax and dividend, which is where you would tax carbon use, for example. So we could tax gasoline and diesel use at $1 a gallon, say, and we could give that tax directly to every individual. So every Australian would get a bonus every year based on the amount of fuel that was used in the country. And that tax could increase every year to increase their income. This would provide a direct incentive for people to use less fossil fuel and provide an immediate benefit for most people who would actually welcome this tax, because for most people it would provide an income rather than a tax. So there are ways to approach these problems cleverly and achieve a better economic future without having to completely change the economic system or face collapse. So, just in summary, a steady state economy is possible. Change is not about collecting evidence. We know the problems. We understand the nature of economics. We understand the nature of the environmental problems we're causing. It's not about collecting evidence any longer. The battle that we need to win is a political battle. It's not a scientific battle. The market, as it's currently structured, is not the solution to our problems. The solutions that are proposed that work within the market, that make degrowth a profitable opportunity, are only tinkering at the edges. We fundamentally need to change the nature of the economic system, and we need to do that gradually from within. And it's about unconventional solutions that change the system progressively, as well as our values and our perceptions, that will allow us to change the world that we have today. That's it from me. I hope you found it useful. I hope the sounds and noises of Hong Kong were not too disruptive, and that you have a profitable, and I don't mean that in the financial sense, I mean that in the intellectual sense, but a profitable and useful few days in Australia. Thank you very much indeed.